for joining West Bangalore Global Digital Summit 2020. This is Abhinami Devi welcoming you, and it's so nice to see you online at this important time. I welcome you, Ms. Alicia Butler Pierre, founder CEO of Facade, and the topic which we're going to talk about is strategies of scaling up the service-based business. Welcome you, ma'am, to the stage.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor to participate in this World Economic Forum. So you want to scale your business. Well, let's first talk about what that actually means, because people often use the phrases growing your business and scaling your business interchangeably, but there's actually a difference. In other words, growing your business might mean going from maybe 10 orders a day to 20 and then eventually 30. But scaling your business means going from processing 10 orders a day to 10,000 orders a day. When we talk about growing your business, it's usually from a marketing perspective. In other words, what are the things that you need to do in order to draw more attention to your business and ultimately more customers? But when we talk about scaling your business, that's actually from an operations perspective. In other words, what are the back office operations that you're going to need to have in place in order to handle all of the new attention and demand that you're getting for your company? Now, speaking of high demand, we're talking about scaling up a service-based business. Now, for service-based companies, we're usually talking about some form of intellectual property and not necessarily inventory and manufacturing equipment. But when we talk about having very high demand for the service that your company offers, we're usually talking about what additional people will we need to supply that demand. In other words, the demand may be very high for your service, but you may not be able to have the ability to supply that demand. So in order to reach it to the point where we get to an equilibrium, that means having more people, better processes, and better tools and technologies. So how exactly do you do that? Well, one strategy that we're going to talk about today is what I call business infrastructure. And when most people hear that word infrastructure, they usually think of IT or they think of transportation. But just as transportation infrastructure links together different modes of transportation so that people and goods can flow as seamlessly as possible, well, the same is true for business infrastructure. We're talking about how to link your people, your processes, and your tools so that work and information flows as seamlessly as possible. And once this business infrastructure is in place, that is what's going to allow you to scale profitably, sustainably, and in a repeatable manner. Now, business infrastructure actually answers 4 questions. What work needs to be done? Who will actually do that work? How is that work organized into departments? And how is that work performed? So I'd like to share with you now, I'll do a quick demo of how we can actually answer those 4 questions. It all starts with identifying all of the work that needs to be done. So what I have here in front of me are different note cards. You can actually use something like this, or you can use sticky notes, but I want you to actually identify every single task that you must perform in your business today, no matter how simple or complex. And you'll usually have at least 100 different tasks, if not several hundred more. But the point of this exercise is to go through a very rigorous brainstorming exercise to figure out what are you actually performing in your company today. What task are you performing? You also want to start thinking about the tasks that you need to perform as you start to scale. So what work are you doing right now, and what work do you know you will have to do in the immediate future? Now, once you start to identify all of those different tasks, I want you to take a large flat surface, maybe a large table if you can, and spread all of these note cards that you have each representing a different task across that large flat surface. I then want you to start grouping tasks that are very similar in nature into columns. We're going to have several vertical columns across this large flat surface. And here in this example, you can see that I have task C2 and task C5. They both belong to the C family, if you will. Now, once you have all of your similar tasks grouped into different columns, I then want you to assign a department name to each of those columns. So for purposes of this exercise, we have C2 and C5 activities or tasks. We're going to just call this Department C. Now, as you start to name every single grouping of tasks, you'll have those departments. You then want to take a look at each department and its associated tasks individually, and then start to assign tasks to roles. So we have here the CEO role, and we may say, well, you know what? Of all of these different tasks within this particular department, these are the tasks that the CEO is supposed to perform. Not what you're currently doing, but in a perfect world, if you had access to all of the resources that you needed, who are all of those different roles that you would have in place to perform these different tasks? This is what's going to give you a very visual understanding of what people you already have in place versus the people that you need to hire in the immediate future. Now, this actually gives you much more descriptive, much more transparent information that you can now use to create your job descriptions, so that as you start to recruit these people to fill these empty positions, you now have a much more descriptive and transparent understanding of all of the things that are expected for that particular role. I even want you to craft a job description even if this is not for an employee, but someone that you may outsource the work to. Okay? Now that you have your tasks, you have your departments, you know who's supposed to be performing which tasks, I then want you to look at each department and its associated tasks and start to think about which tasks may still go together within that particular department. So let's just say hypothetically, if C2 represented paying an invoice and C5 may represent receiving payment from your customers. You may say, well, you know what? This task C2 really represents an accounts payable process, and C5 may represent an accounts receivable process. Now you have an understanding of all of the processes that actually need to be documented within each of your departments. Because remember, when you hire people, they definitely will need to know how to perform their work and how will their work actually be measured. And the last step in all of this is to then look at each of your processes and figure out which tools and technologies you will need to perform that process. And when I say tools, that could mean anything from different forms, templates, checklists. It could also mean different types of equipment, such as a phone or a computer, a laptop, a camera, for example. And technologies, we know, obviously means different types of software and mobile apps that you may have access to. Now, once you go through that exercise, which can be very tedious, that in essence answers those 4 questions that we talked about earlier. What work needs to be done? How is that work organized into departments? Who ideally should be performing that work? And how is that work actually performed? That, believe it or not, is setting the foundation for you to be able to scale sustainably and profitably. Now, I know we covered this very quickly, but if you would like to know the details step by step of how to actually implement this in your company, please check out my book. It's called Behind the Facade: How to Structure Company Operations for Sustainable Success. This book will actually give you, again, a very detailed step-by-step guide for how you can go through the exercises that I just summarized for you. And it's available anywhere online books are sold, especially Amazon, of course. Another place where you can learn more on a weekly basis about how to implement business infrastructure so that you can scale your business is through my podcast. It's a weekly podcast, and it's called the Business Infrastructure Curing Back Office Blues podcast. And it's available anywhere you download and listen to your podcasts. And lastly, you can always reach out to me personally on Twitter or LinkedIn. Just look for me at Alicia Butler Pierre. We can connect there, and I'm more than happy to answer any specific questions that you may have. Thank you so much for your time. We can now open the floor for any questions that you may have.